Yeah, I'm just really excited to be here. I love speaking to groups like this. People think kind of nature conservation is happening in places like Kruger, but it really is groups like yourselves that are on the cutting edge. If you think about the place you live, the landscape that's around you is equally granite grassland, critically endangered. Even bringing back a small part of your garden, 200 squares, we know brings back biodiversity and insects. You guys are really at the front lines. So excited to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about what the company does. I focused a lot on residential aspects that you'll see in the work that we've done. And we're going to leave lots of time for questions. So please write those down or think of them as we go through. So really, we as a firm exist because of this scientific fact. No matter what Trump says, climate change is a real thing. We're seeing happening across the world. And if you see the CO2E, that only means that it's all greenhouse gases. So if you see the E, that just means equivalent. So if you see any kind of greenhouse gas reporting from the UN or whatever, that just means that things like methane have been translated into a CO2 or carbon dioxide equivalent. And if we had to summarize our practice into one sentence, this would be it. Reversing local extinction through sustainable architecture. We're seeing kind of two extinctions happening across Africa. One is natural, our wildlife and our species, and the other is cultural. Specifically in terms of architecture, the way that Africans have built for hundreds of years. A lot of it very, very sustainable is being replaced. There's a lot of Chinese impact as you go north. And so yeah, we exist as a firm to try and reverse these degraded systems, try to bring that back in terms of what sustainability means, which kind of means a million things at the moment. For us, it really is a simple journey between efficiency, how you're using kind of circular economy, comes up a lot, how you're using your resources efficiently, and net zero, which I'm sure we've heard a lot of. The South African Green Building Council helps us set up kind of the definitions of these words. In South Africa, we have 4 net zero categories: carbon, water, waste, and ecology. And we're trying to think about, if you hear net zero, just think about zero harm to the natural environment in those 4 categories. We're one of the leaders in the world because the rest of the world is focusing specifically on carbon. The UK is now thinking a little bit about biodiversity. We're the only Green Building Council in the world that's looking at all 4 categories at the same time. So really, special place to be in terms of being an architect. This is some of the services we offer, so just to understand the breadth of what we do. So kind of from technology development, we see architecture and landscape design as one design discipline, all the way through to infrastructure design. We've got projects that focus on human-wildlife conflict. And then kind of the auditing side. So if we need to claim that your building is green or eco or whatever word you want to use, how do we benchmark that across the world? What are those metrics, those performance metrics of sustainability? All the way from EPCs, which I'm sure you've seen, you buy your fridge, there's that like rating on it. That's now a legal requirement for certain buildings in South Africa. And then you've got this myriad of ratings. Every country seems to have one. We've got our own called Green Star that we adopted from the Australians. So that's really what we do in a nutshell. Most of our inspiration comes from travel. We take kind of 2 large-scale expeditions across Africa studying how Africans have lived in pristine landscapes for thousands of years. And it's been incredible over the last 10 years, the practice is 10 years old this year, just to see how much intelligence exists in these places with people still living really integrated into the natural environment. And a lot of what we're taught is kind of, or maybe what we feel about architecture is kind of the African side is primitive in some kind of way, using primitive materials. But kind of before colonialism, we were building with the same kind of tech that was happening across Europe. And arguably, I would say more sophisticated. If you look at Great Zimbabwe, you had a biodegradable construction material and a permanent one that was locally sourced from around the area, based obviously on their cattle-based economy. This is me and my family. I'm the little guy there, visiting Great Zimbabwe for the first time. And a lot of my relationship with sustainability is based on really going back into where my family's come from. I'm kind of 8th generation South African, and this is kind of the Afrikaner, my family track that went all the way up to Rhodesia in kind of the early 1900s. And my family had kind of a very different relationship with nature that probably I have today. My dissertation at the University of Johannesburg was pretty controversial for that time. So I graduated about 13 years ago. And my whole dissertation was questioning, could we bring back a species that had been kicked out of the city, something that people maybe disliked, something like the Cape vulture. And what would that mean for the city if the Cape vulture was considered an equal citizen with people? How would the city have to change in terms of that? And then I got heavily invested in net zero. We found that, I know it's probably too small to read, but we found that that was one of the easiest green building ratings to explain to clients. Net zero basically means, if you think about carbon, that what the energy used within a building, everything that you generated is from a renewable source. You measure net zero over a 1 year period, and the word net zero in terms of that simple calculations means the same here as it does in South Africa. Net zero water would be that all your water sources are on a renewable source. Things like rainwater, treated black or grey water. And I've tried to not talk too much about technology in this presentation. I'm happy to answer questions around what's the best, what should we do. But most important, I think, for each of you is to think about a target, have some kind of aim. When we sit with a client, we ask them, what is your 2030, 2050 goal from a corporate point of view, and how we filter that down into a technology-based decision. Net zero waste means that you're not sending any waste to landfill. That can be in construction waste or operational waste. And net zero ecology means that you're bringing back kind of the locally extinct landscape of what used to be there before the city, which is really one of the focus areas of our practice. I don't want to get too technical, but this is how net zero design would work compared to kind of the traditional way that we've been taught as built environment professionals. So generally we have the engineer, the QS, the architect, the landscape architect. We all kind of work in our silos because we're professionally responsible for that. Unfortunately, a net zero building doesn't happen in that context. You have to work in an integrated way from the beginning. So that comes from setting targets, if that's corporate targets, carbon targets, water targets, and then that translates down into the design, and that generally has to be client-led and signed off from the beginning. Analyzing weather's a big one. This Mall of Africa, they designed for past climate and not future climate. So they've had massive issues from an air conditioning point of view. So just how do we model these really complicated scenarios from it's a lot like computer-based modeling to test our designs, has to be taking into account climate change. That's the computer-based modeling part. And then after construction commissioning, so a lot of times we as professionals, we hand you the building and we say, have fun. And that can't happen with a sustainable building. You really got to drive it really well in terms of, you know, when you're putting the aircon on. I'm sure people leave the aircons on overnight, which has been a big problem, or lights on. Like, how do you use this building in a practical way? And then the last thing is obviously, again, educating the building users on how to use the building. So if you get this right, you're starting to approach kind of what a net zero building is. And if for those that are interested, just to show you kind of just a small sampling of the green building ratings that exist across the world. So if you say net zero is kind of zero impact, zero harm, everything below the line is trying to be kind of less bad, if we call it that. There's no kind of judgment. It's really, every client is on a different journey depending on where they are. For you guys, Edge is probably the most relevant. A free tool, non-technical. It looks at 3 categories: energy, water, and materials. And it's what makes it a really great tool is there's kind of costing involved with your decision making around a design that you can use. I'm happy to speak more about that later on. LEED is your American rating, oldest green building council in the world. Green Star is ours, which like I said, we borrowed from the Australians and rewrote for our context. Then you've got things above the line like WELL, which is a green building standard based purely on human health. How does our buildings affect our health with peer-reviewed scientific research? Living Building Challenge, most difficult rating in the world. We haven't got a building yet in South Africa. And then from a legal point of view, what's happening, and I think this is important for decision making around not having a stranded asset over time. So energy performance certificates are now legal for large-scale buildings like commercial offices, large government buildings, things above 2,000 square meters. And then we're seeing what happens with our energy regulations, which is SANS 10400. The EUI, which is basically your watts per square meter over a 1 year period. That number that you have to submit for council is dropping over time. So that's how they're going to force you to become net zero. Is that when you submit your plans, you're going to have to prove that I'm using this amount, I'm efficient when I come to this kind of energy use, so that it kind of makes it a no-brainer for you to then put PV on. And then the big thing is our 5 major cities have signed on to have net zero carbon built environments by 2030 for new buildings and 2050 for existing buildings. And this is kind of C40s is the global program of kind of the big cities in the world. I don't know if we'll be able to achieve it, but the ambition is there. So you'll see kind of behind the scenes this kind of ambition moving into policy, moving into what like we as architects need to submit. And then the cutting edge really is about carbon within not just the electricity we use, this kind of coming out of coal power, I'm assuming, but down to the materials that we're designing for. So that the carbon footprint in the glass, in the aluminium, and that's called embodied carbon. So if people are interested in that, that's kind of the emerging field. This is kind of the best practice in the world. Architects, QSs, structural engineers are starting to do these whole life carbon assessments on their buildings, to kind of look at the carbon footprint across the lifespan of the building. And then since we've started in 2017, we've kind of done the first kind of net zero projects for South Africa, a lot of them targeting even more than one rating. So from the first government project to net positive ecology project, and I'll show you some of those as we go. And then received recognition in the process of that. So let me start with the first project. So this was the first project to be rated as triple net zero. So net zero carbon in terms of operational energy, net zero water, everything from a renewable source, and net positive ecology. So we brought back the historic landscape of Linden, Igoli granite grassland, and focused on using a created wetland. As we know, wetlands are kind of, developers run away from them because they're scary to build on. We said, could we design the landscaping first? Could we bring the highest biodiversity back first using landscape, and then design the architecture within that system? And the power of that design approach was that the wetland became our water storage device. It became an opportunity for aquaculture and food security. And we've just recently, it's taken us 3 years to finish the landscape. Now we can start doing the architecture. So even the way that we build on a sensitive landscape now changes how we design. This is South Africa's first net zero carbon operational government building. So we were appointed by the Office of the Presidency, which kind of sits above the departments, thank goodness. And they gave us a brief to kind of relook at the healthcare standards. They wanted a standardized clinic design that they could build across the country. Because again, a clinic built in Limpopo or the Eastern Cape was costing kind of different things. You needed to change the door handles and it was a different spec. To kind of standardize as much of that as possible. We convinced them to target net zero carbon. We just said your building will be irrelevant in 2030 if it's not operating at this. And we could justify payback periods for them to say the operational cost of this building is the benefits far exceeds it doing the typical way. And it helped us rewrite standards for water efficiency and energy efficiency standards which don't exist. We don't have water and efficiency and energy standards at a clinic level. So yeah, this was the project, kind of clad in a green wall. You had solar panels within 2 layers of glass called flexi-film. So a big problem is solar panel theft in rural areas. So you literally, this function that's kind of not a double roof where you've got your panels and then your roof. That's the glass lets light come through into kind of the courtyard, which is also a communal library. And if to steal them, you literally have to break the glass, break the panel. So that kind of thinking from the electrical engineer was really, really well done. Then at the moment we're doing a lot of work in Zambia. Our client is African Parks, who kind of runs conservation areas for African governments over like 20-year contracts. And they've asked us to kind of redevelop sustainable building materials for Zambians. So as we know, Zambian hardwood, Rhodesian hardwood, we've heard of that before. A lot of those forests, Mayombo forests, are getting cut down. There's a lot of Asian influence, illegal influence in terms of that. We asked ourselves, could we take this building material that's been exploited and find a sustainable way to use it instead of just ignoring it? We're just building with concrete. So this building, we found the only FSC certified forestry in Zambia. FSC is your kind of international mark for sustainable forestry. You get audited once a year. Are you cutting down too many trees? This guy was just exporting all his wood to Europe. There was no local demand. When we visited the sawmill, we found that maybe 40% of the tree was getting thrown away. We only use about 60%, the branches, the bark, all the stuff gets thrown away. We said, could we use some of the stuff as cladding? So this is the bark of Mpani. which I'm sure most of you know. It sits on a base of, we call it kiot, which we charred, which is a Japanese way. Instead of kind of putting varnish on, you char it. And this, we're doing a submission at the moment. This will be the first project, probably in the world, maybe let's say Africa, where the carbon that the wood stores is more than the embodied carbon of the steel and the concrete use. So that means that the carbon footprint, in an embodied carbon point of view, is net zero, which has never been done before. But again, don't quote me yet. Let's get the rating and then we can chat more. This is the school we're doing in the same area for African parks, really looking at the village layout and how we can translate that into school design. There's still a strong colonial influence in terms of how schools are designed in Zambia, kind of dual row, kind of military-based form of education. We've done a lot of healthcare. Healthcare is probably your most tricky one from a sustainability point of view and a technology point of view. This, just from a cladding point of view, kind of uses recycled bottles as your brise-soleil or your sun shading on top of the glass. So really, solar glass is kind of really fancy glass that has plastic in between. That becomes quite expensive. So we said, can we use normal clear glazing and use kind of plastic bottles as your sunshade and privacy device for the clinic. And then the clinic kind of changes color between white and red depending on surrounding air pollution. So this kind of trying to take something invisible from a health point of view and making it physically and able to be seen. This was South Africa's first net positive construction waste project. And this project is just shows what a small project, the impact a small project can make. So don't think like your project is too small or your landscaping is too small to make a difference. This was a heritage renovation for a client who really wanted to push the boundaries for sustainability. We were able to, net positive waste means that we're taking waste, we're net zero, and then we're taking waste that would have gone to landfill, using that into the construction process. So this will be we are able to divert 120 tons of construction waste from landfill into this project. And we've had conversations with contractors before that say net zero waste construction was impossible. So you just need one project. You just need one project to show that it can be done, and you change the mindsets of the construction industry. This is another project that really looked at an alternative method of building compared to kind of brick and mortar. So this is a very lightweight steel-clad building with insulation and timber on the outside. Again, directly inspired from kind of its high-fought grassland that it brought back. And then we realized kind of there was potential for disruption within the landscape industry. We found, we were doing a lot of projects with the Igodi granite grassland, and we found there was an interest for people to bring that back into their gardens. So we took kind of the plant list that we developed of about 150, 200 species, and translated that into seeds that you could buy and you could sow. And just obviously the cost of seeds, 200, what was this? This does about 200 square meters for 150 rand. It gives people an incentive, and there's something wonderful to watch when people plant a plant from seed, and you really have to protect it from the frost and everything else. It kind of creates a really intimate relationship with the landscape that I haven't seen before, which is wonderful to watch. This was the first net positive ecology landscape for South Africa for an existing building. So it also doesn't mean you have to build a new building, you can do it on an existing project. This brought back about 140 species of Igodi granite grassland native species. So every one of these little plants is native. And then we've got a strategic partnership with the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Clinic, which I'm sure most of you know, to kind of start releasing and rebuilding food chains within this landscape. Like things like moles are fantastic soil mixers that mix all the nutrients back into the soil. So this becomes really exciting for us to look at landscape design beyond just plants. Then we had the client ask us, well, how do we monitor the biodiversity of this place? And we said we don't know. We'll invent a technology. So this is the Landia device, which is a separate spin-off company that came out of our R&D division. This monitors bird call 24/7. So using AI classifier, we've heard these bird calls. I've had to train it to not get confused. It gets confused often, like a truck reversing is like a black cuckoo. But this has been wonderful. This has now been in operation for 18 months. To see the landscape change and see birds coming back, and how we can use birds as biodiversity indicators. If we get this bird back, it means this. That's been wonderful, as well as kind of it monitors climate and air pollution at the same time, which we're translating into data within the lobby. So you come into the office, oh, okay, air pollution is heavy, noise pollution is heavy, these kind of invisible pollutions that we don't really talk about, made visible for people to access. As well as things like hearing European bee eater for the first time, which they come from Europe, people don't know that, and using that to signal summer. So how do we engage with seasonal change, and how biodiversity can be seasonal change indicators for people in their everyday lives? We've done a lot of micro-housing for places like informal settlements in Cape Town, and this is in Alex. So this was a research process that was a long journey with the community around what is their most terrifying threat, and fire, runaway fire with informal settlement is kind of the biggest one. This was a research process looking at fire-resistant trees like Proteocaphora that has fire-resistant bark. How do we translate that into facade, and again using materials that can protect themselves from fire. This was net zero carbon, net zero water, and we argued that could the building create a microeconomic system for the people that live within it? You know, kind of housing being one of these things that can break generational poverty. But if the building's not making money for you monthly, there's really no money that you have for maintaining it. And so we don't speak about sustainability when it comes to these projects. It's about what is the economic benefit of the building to the person that's living there. This is called the Lighthouse. It's kind of a similar typology, much cheaper than the previous one, which built out of cross-laminated timber. This used kind of our existing scaffold system from the construction industry, clad that with materials that people know how to work with from within the township, and still creating kind of an embedded, the technology is embedded within the structure of the unit. We've had a lot of conversations with the banks around this in terms of if they could decouple their funding model from having to own the land. Could they finance the structure itself with professional sign-off? Because then we'd be able to scale this. Then people would be able to get a bond on this, like someone would be able to get a bond on a vehicle. That's kind of where these projects are sitting. And then the last project, which some of you might already be familiar with, but I love ending with in presentations, just to talk about the scale of impact we can have as human beings, and how your site is obviously connected to a whole bunch of other sites in terms of how wildlife moves. So this is another R&D project that we started about 5 years ago that talks about a 1,000 kilometer elephant migration route. It connects the existing kind of the green areas here. You can see Kruger there. The green areas are your kind of big existing game reserves, Pilanesberg, Macaliesberg, and we said, could we link them with an elephant migration route? African elephants are endangered, but we cull them in Kruger, give them contraceptive in Addo, and we are an example in South Africa for how the rest of Africa will develop in terms of a closed conservation system. We use fences. With things like Botswana and Namibia, the wildlife still moves across. So there's a lot of value that we can have in terms of this kind of R&D project. So there's two tech aspects here. The one is at the bottom is a camera technology, AI, that identifies an elephant, what an elephant looks like. We're going to train it with hundreds of thousands of images, and opens a gate in a fence line for that animal alone. So you can still keep things like lion or cattle or other dangerous game on your property. Obviously you could train it to do 1,000 things, seeing people, noise, whatever. So this was the first time the AI actually got it right with the elephants moving through. And then this guy in the background, in terms of our professional team, is a musician who did his master's in elephant acoustics. And he invented, it really is a new elephant language to communicate with the animal, to teach them how to use the route. So he's invented two words, kind of come and go, that plays at infrasound. So infrasound is kind of, humans hear to about 20 hertz, below that is infrasound. When the lightning strikes and you see the building vibrate, that's infrasound. That's infrasound by vibrating the building. They hear to about 4 kilometers, and kind of last 50 years we've only really started to understand their intelligence from a language point of view. They name each other, they're able to identify male and female. There's different dialects across Africa. So this became a really exciting project for us to to really move, not just about regeneration of the landscape, but how do we rebuild communication systems between us as human beings and the natural world, and elephants probably being one of the easiest species to do that because they're so clever. So this project, the prototype, was built at Adventures with Elephants in Limpopo. Franco, we exhibited this specific work in the Venice Biennale in Italy last year. He's now traveling across South Africa, training matriarchs on what this language means in order for them to move across fence lines. So that's it. I don't want to say anything too much. This is our team. I'm glad I'm not alone. We have a director of sustainability who really focuses on the auditing engineering side, a director of architecture that really takes these kind of my crazy drawings on the page and brings them out the ground. And then I'm kind of responsible for R&D. But yeah, just thank you for your time this evening.